Hello and welcome to the Basement Book Club. It's a club in a basement where we talk about books. And the book we're going to be talking about in this basement today is Sword Art Online Progressive, which is basically Sword Art Online, only more progressive, but not that much more progressive. Now, if you haven't seen my review of SAO Alicization yet and you don't know what's going on here, at the end of that video I said that I wanted to take a look at Reki Kawahara's actual writing. And from what I've heard, the best example of that is SAO Progressive, which is basically a reboot of the Aincrad arc that follows Kirito's adventures floor by floor instead of time-skipping all over the place like the original book and the original anime do. If you do want to have full context for what we're talking about, because this story does cover a lot more than just the first 2 episodes of SAO, then I encourage you to pause this video, go to the link in the doobly-doo to today's sponsor, Bookwalker, and buy SAO Progressive for yourself. If you use the promo code BASEMENT when you check out, you can get a 600 yen discount on that, which basically I think makes the book around $2 or $3. So it's real cheap, and I will say that it's a pretty easy and fast read, despite being like 400 pages long, which it doesn't need to be. But we'll get into that, and a lot more. Now, of course, I've got a lot of my own opinions about this book, but the focus of this video is more on all of your opinions. A bunch of you guys sent in your thoughts about SAO Progressive to bookclubbasement@gmail.com, and I'm going to be reading through and responding to various thoughts that you sent me in your emails. Unfortunately, I won't be able to get to every email that was sent to me because there were a lot, and I won't even be able to get to every point in every one of the emails that I am talking about because a lot of you guys sent in like full-blown reviews and essays, and those are amazing, but I just am not able to fit all of those into a reasonably sized YouTube video for human consumption. So instead I've taken out chunks that sort of connect to themes that I wanted to talk about, and we're just sort of going to go through and see where that leads us. As it's an expansion on the story of Aincrad that goes into really granular detail, obviously SAO Progressive ends up adding a lot to the story of SAO. Some of that comes in the form of world building, some of that comes in the form of just more story. But one of the big changes is that Reki Kawahara has added a lot of new characters and also improved, I would say pretty substantially, on the characterization of the characters who are there. Now, if you've seen any of my videos about SAO, you'll know that one of my biggest complaints about the series is the lack of personality in its supporting cast and even its leads. So that was really nice for me to see. And Kirito especially gets a surprising amount of development in this story. The first-person narration kind of lets us get inside of his head, where we can see that he's very self-conscious and constantly thinking about what other people think of him, when most of the time they're not thinking about him at all, and I think that adds an interesting dimension to his character. A lot of you basement dwellers also picked up on this change in Kirito's characterization and seemed to appreciate it. For example, Jacob wrote, "I can actually believe Kirito's not good at dealing with people now, and seeing a less brooding side of him through things like calculating the volume of a slice of cake. This could be a side effect of moving from the anime to having an internal narrator, a move that makes even In Another World with my smartphone more enjoyable, but I am willing to give Reki Kawahara the benefit of the doubt here, and I'm inclined to agree with that. I think that he did make a conscious effort to give Kirito more personality than the almost none that he had in the anime and the original books." Hinako added, "A lot of this novel focused on the tension between beta testers and regular players, and it's really annoying how Kirito places himself in this argument. He keeps harping on how he's abandoned everyone for his own self-interest, but he acts completely different from a loner. He cooperates with an information dealer and works alongside Asuna the whole time. It's an MMORPG, for goodness sake. You can't do everything alone. He's only 14, so I don't think he understands himself well, despite thinking that he does." I kind of pick up on that too. I think that Kirito doesn't really have a grasp on how other people think and how he's really thinking of the situation, and he comes down on himself a little harder than he should be, maybe, while also being a little bit arrogant about his own game-playing abilities. I think there's an interesting character there, is what I'm saying. Although some of Reki Kawahara's worst habits do kind of get in the way of that characterization, which was also touched on by Mega Fighter 3. Early on in Aria of a Starless Night, Kirito displays some cringy, sexist thoughts about female MMO players that really made me dread the rest of the novel. But these thankfully fell to the wayside after a while. It's hard to keep my eyes on a Kindle when they're constantly rolling. Kirito's personality, for the most part, was enjoyable. I especially loved the added touches like his love for his terrible scarf or his propensity for bad jokes making him into a massive dork. After having the image of him as broody sword McLongcoat burned into my head, it was nice to have him brought down to earth as a nerdy gamer nerd. And yeah, I would agree that Kirito does come off as a pretty typical socially awkward gamer, right down to the kind of cringy stuff that he says. Like, he has an entire full page-length aside where he thinks to himself about how weird it is for a girl to be playing an MMORPG, and then he, like, turns to the audience and he's like, girls don't play MMORPGs, so it's really weird that I ran into a girl here. And then it comes back and he's like, but I don't want to be one of those people who approaches people in MMORPGs just because they're girls. Not that I want to come down on those people. It's just so excessive for explaining what is, I would say, a pretty commonly held misconception about the demographics of MMORPGs. It feels completely unnecessary, in addition to being really cringy and a little bit sexist. And that's not the only problem with that this book has, but we'll get to that in a sec. So a lot about Kirito's character has improved in Progressive, but the story is still following the same basic outline as the original light novel and the TV show, and there is a lot of stuff from that that's still really dumb. I would say the biggest example of problems that have carried over from the original text into this one would be the whole beater thing, where there's this discrimination against beta testers, and in order to take the heat off his fellow beta testers, Kirito declares that he's not just a beta tester, he's not just a cheater, he's a beater, which is even stupider than it sounds, if you can believe that. And a lot of you guys were bothered by that too. Phosphorescence King wrote, either Kirito is just very assumptive about things where he doesn't need to be, and there's actually not that much conflict going on, or the story does a really bad job of actually portraying the persecution Kirito faces for being a beater as a horrible burden to bear. Before the first boss raid, Kirito makes a lot of internal assumptions about how the beta testers get treated, and he starts to worry about how Argo will be treated as an exposed beta tester right before he makes his big, dumb, idiotic speech. However, we never actually see anything particularly bad come from this persecution, like bullying or harassment or other people attempting to screw testers over, or not letting them in teams or whatever. And yeah, I would agree that that is a bit of a problem with how this whole concept's been executed, in addition to it just being dumb on the surface. I guess the idea that people would be angry at the beta testers as sort of like a transitive way of getting their frustrations about being stuck in the game out does make sense, but you don't really see that actually pour over into any meaningful harm to any of the characters, at least not in the first volume. Maybe it's going for that. Maybe it is going for the whole, this is really all in Kirito's head, and this whole thing about the beta testers isn't that big a deal outside of like the frontline players who are like very much concerned with optimizing their character builds and being as strong as possible. He even says that a lot of the beta testers were among the first people to die because they charged in and got killed early. So I don't know if Reki Kawahara is trying to make a point that Kirito's persecution complex is more in his head than it is outside it. That would be like a really good, potentially interesting and smart storytelling decision, and there's some stuff that suggests that it might be going in that direction, but at the same time, I don't think it is. I think that he's just trying to reconcile the fact that Kirito did this thing at the start of the story with the fact that the beta tester bigotry never really comes up at all. If it's gonna come up, it'll be within the next couple volumes, because, you know, once they get past floor 10, where all of the beta testers' advantages are rendered moot by the fact that, you know, everybody's on the same page of lack of information, that will, I think, be the end point where any kind of rage against the testers can come to fruition in the story. I mean, I don't even know if it's going to go that far. It would be interesting if he subverted it and just made it like, yeah, Kirito thought it was a big deal, but actually no one cared ever and it was just, it was making a mountain out of a molehill. We'll see where that goes. Now, not everybody who wrote in was a big fan of how Kirito was characterized, even outside of the whole beta tester thing. And one review that was sent in that I thought was very well written came from Benny, and I feel bad cutting this up at all. I feel like I'm butchering it because it was so cohesive and well put together, and when I do post the emails, I urge you guys to check out Benny's review because it's just great start to finish. But I really especially liked his take on how Kirito sort of loses his character a little bit to his role as an exposition machine. So here's what Benny had to say. What sets Kirito apart from the game world? Where does his knowledge end and his personality begin? I would say that the closest thing to personality is when he talks about his family. He wonders what his sister's up to, how his family is doing, what kind of care he's getting in the hospital. Those wistful thoughts are something I wanted to see more of because they connect Kirito to the real world and help ground him in a plane between reality and the virtual. But sadly, these moments are few and far between, with much of the dialogue and descriptions following the expository route, which is a shame because there's a lot of room to include these moments with 100 floors to tackle and write about. Instead of describing mindless RPG side quests, leaning into the characters and the individual floors would have made for a more gripping story, and it's one that I hope the author takes up in later volumes. I loved Argo the Rat and her double dealing. I could see her frizzy, wild hair and mouse-like mannerisms vividly, and she was by far the most interesting part of the story. I enjoyed Asuna's tsundere personality, but she was definitely overplayed in sections of the book. I even came to find some purchase with the Legend Braves Guild and their story of atonement, because all of these characters had personality, which is something that was lacking from the main character. Dialogue should help each character to have an identifiable speech, voice, and tone, and they all sounded different from each other. I don't think that Reki Kawahara trusts his character well enough to give Kirito his own voice, because presently the voice of Kirito is the voice of the author. If Kirito stopped talking about the game entirely and let the narrative continue the exposition, what would he say? What would he sound like on his own? How would he act on a good day versus a bad one? Because presently there is little to explore in this direction, and it's up to the reader to fill in those gaps that the author has left behind. I do think that Benny's being a little bit harsh here, because there are some things that come forward about Kirito's character. He talks about a lot of stuff in very mathematical terms, and he sort of shies away from naturalistic expressions that regular people who don't play a lot of video games would make. So I do think that he is characterized to a certain degree. I also think that a lot of his character is probably based on Reki Kawahara, and that makes it a little bit difficult to separate Kirito's personality from the more objective third-person narration that is used in Asuna's segments of the story. So I don't think that Kirito is completely lacking in personality, but I do think that he could be a lot better. This is the best that I've seen him in a Sword Art Online story, but, there is a far cry from that to any better light novel that I've read. Now, in talking about Kirito, Benny brought up Argo the Rat, who is one of the biggest additions to SAO Progressive. She's a info broker who uses the information that she has from the beta test as well as a network of contacts to help people learn more about the game and their fellow players. She's kind of the closest thing to a GameFAQs that anybody in the world of SAO has. So she plays like an interesting, vital role in the society around Kirito, while also having like a connection to Kirito because they're both beta testers, they're both friends with each other. She's got a different kind of strength than he does that I think is really interesting, because to this point, Sword Art Online has really only ever been about strength in terms of physical ability, agility, and reaction time, like your ability to be good at a video game. And seeing somebody who's strong in a different way, who's like intelligent and calculating, is neat. That's something that was brought up in an email from Kyle K, who wrote, Argo the Rat is a welcome introduction as a fellow beta tester who's overpowered in a way distinct from Kirito. Her information network and deep knowledge of the game makes her an important variable in the story that Kirito can't just overpower. It would be nice to see some villains in later books with a similar strength behind them. And I do think that there's a lot of potential in this kind of character moving forward for SAO's storytelling, but I also just really want to see Argo come back because she's really fun. Like, I wasn't able to include all of the quotes because a lot of them, like Benny's, were included in bigger points about other things in the story, but almost literally everybody who wrote in had something nice to say about Argo. Adrian wrote that Argo has a sense of ethics, which is weird to say since we're reading SAO, where the mass murderer Kayaba Akihiko is hailed as a saint. No ethical dilemmas there, nope. She refuses to out the beta testers no matter what the price, out of fear that there will be witch hunts. Also, her feelings of obligation toward giving info to new players show us that she feels she owes the world for having all of the knowledge of the beta and allowing 2,000 people to die before the first floor was even cleared. I like all of this. Having another well-rounded character to offset Kirito's blank-slatedness made reading the parts with Argo and Kirito in them much more bearable. And yeah, Kirito has a fun dynamic with Argo too. That's part of why she's a really fun character. She sort of teases him. She's one of the few characters who you get the impression Reki has allowed to actually be smarter than Kirito. And yeah, she just presents sort of like a different paradigm of character strength than we've really seen in SAO before. It's exciting in a way to see Reki Kawahara branching out in that direction. I know that that's very, very basic writing for good stories in most other cases, but in the case of SAO, that is a real sign of improvement, that there's somebody who is tough and capable and not just good at swinging swords at stuff real fast. To give you some idea of how universal the praise for Argo as a character is, Cynthia opened with one of the most low-key savage review intros I've ever read. There's two things you need to know about me. One, I'm a bookworm. I can finish an entire volume of a light novel I enjoy within the same day. The more I enjoy it, the faster I read. Two, I used to play MMORPGs. To be honest, I got SAOP as soon as I finished watching your video and started reading it right there and then, but I literally just finished it a few minutes ago. She sent me this email on June 13th, and what follows is some merciless bashing of just about everything in the book, except for Argo. What I did enjoy was every scene with Argo. I really like the character, and I ship her better than Asuna. I mean, if she's even part of his not a harem. I really wish we could have seen more of her in the anime. Instead, all we got was an extremely short scene of the Christmas episode where she tells Keyboy about Nicholas the Renegade. The backstory about her whiskers was amusing. She's an info broker, but she still went out of her way to help the players with the actual boss on the second floor. She risked her life to do it. I think the difference between her and Asuna is quite clear. Argo is trying her best to live, and not just for her, but for every one of the weaker players by providing her guides for free. She exposes herself to dangers to find the information she needs, and clears quests on her own if she needs to do that. She's one of the best characters that Reki Kawahara's ever written, by like a wide margin, I would say, and I'm really excited because I've heard that she's finally going to be coming back to the anime in the next arc of the light novels has her coming back, but maybe they'll make an anime out of SAO Progressive while they're waiting for that light novel arc to get a little further ahead. That'd be fun. I would probably actually really enjoy watching that. Now, if we're going to be talking about heroines in SAO, it's like impossible not to talk about Asuna, and she's got one of the best, I would say, glow-ups of any character in SAO in Progressive. Hydra Tower said, Asuna is finally given character development. I'm sure you'll rip into it one way or another, but it's nice to see something, including individual motivations. This is also the return to my favorite spunky version of Asuna before she flipped to the boring, perfect waifu mode we see later in the series. Reki Kawahara said he initially wasn't going to give the main heroine role to Asuna, but he thought that it wouldn't feel right if he didn't, and I'm glad he had a change of heart. The relationship between Asuna and Kirito is the best it's ever been. The manga almost treats it like a campy rom-com, but the light novel at least takes it a bit more seriously. That is something that did kind of bother me in reading the author's notes at the end of the book. Reki basically said that he had to alter the canon of SAO in order to fit Asuna into Kirito's story much earlier, because he needed a companion, obviously, and that makes me feel like maybe he's a little too caught up in this paradigm that there has to be a love interest in every story that he tells, that everything's got to have that romantic component, that there's got to be fan service, and there's a lot of fan service, we'll get to that. You know, I think it would have been fun if he maybe broke away from that and had Kirito going on adventures with Klein, for example. I think that that would have been a lot of fun. But I will agree that Asuna's character development is worth the decisions that he made, even if other things would have been better, and that her relationship with Kirito in particular in this book is a pretty fun to read. Now, Mega Fighter 3 had this to say about her. Asuna also shines in this book, presenting her early on as a fatalistic individual who is determined to just live as long as she can to eventually breaking through to becoming the determined fencer who wants to defeat the game, who we know from the rest of the anime. Plus, the banter between her and Kirito is great, and I did get a chuckle whenever she'd succumb to the simple pleasures of a good bath or delicious food. Asuna's a true millennial, I tell ya. I do think that Reki Kawahara still has a bit of a problem with, like, writing women as characters outside of female stereotypes, because a lot of Asuna's characterization in this is stuff like, oh, I just want a hot bath. I could really go for some sweets. And he doesn't go very far beyond that, although she is a pampered rich girl, so that makes sense for her character specifically to an extent. But the fact that Reki Kawahara is trying to write a female protagonist as a protagonist at all is a big step for him. And I hope that he continues to evolve how he writes her, because right now it's a little bit lacking in my mind, although it is still a vast improvement over where it was before. I'd like to see him keep taking this and keep evolving it, because I think there's potential there. As a lot of people mentioned, her relationship with Kirito is also really fun, and one of the interesting things about this book is that it switches back and forth with each chapter between Kirito and Asuna's perspectives. So we sort of see how they view each other as strangers before we get to know them as a pair or a couple, or however you want to put it. And I think that that's a really interesting dynamic that changes things up and prevents this from feeling like 100% the Kirito variety hour. Obviously, a lot of her thoughts are still focused on Kirito, but the further away we get from that sort of myopic point of view, the better. And a lot of people had good things to say about their relationship as well. Jacob wrote in, they lack chemistry at first, but I honestly ended up quite enjoying some of their later exchanges, like Asuna ardently shutting down Kirito's attempts to be a lone wolf, or when she throws the nut into his mouth after calling him out for pretending it was someone else who had their things stolen by the gremlins in the dungeon during the beta. And yeah, they do have, I would say, pretty good chemistry with each other. They've got a fun dynamic that's not 100% dominated by sexual tension yet, because first and foremost, they're friends. Although Reki Kawahara does cram a lot of that in there. Meowth900 added, one thing I appreciate a lot so far in the story, without spoilers for future books, is that Kirito and Asuna's relationship is progressing at a slower pace compared to the original light novel and anime's rush to get them to be a couple. It's nice seeing them becoming friends. I agree with that. I think that it's cool to see these two characters operating on a basis that's less based on, sexual tension between them or their lovey-dovey doe-eyes act, and more based on just, they've got clashing personalities, and there's obviously some romantic chemistry between them because they are going to be a couple eventually, but it's more focused on them sort of pushing each other to grow in a friendly manner with occasional very, very awkward interludes of fan service, and less about, the end goal of this is they're obviously going to be a couple and we're just counting the minutes for that to happen. And it's really interesting to see SAO diving into the meat and potatoes of that dynamic instead of just rushing headlong 2 years later when they become a couple. I don't know if he's actually going to do it because, it's Reki Kawahara, but it would be nice if they really explored the idea that men and women can just be friends and have a healthy relationship on that basis. That might be a very helpful thing for some people who read SAO to learn, some of the younger nerds. I know that is something that I would have benefited from learning from some of the fiction that I was watching when I was a teenager. And I think that there's potential here for Asuna and Kirito's relationship to serve as a template, and I mean this 100% unironically, for a very healthy relationship between a nerdy guy and a girl. Potentially. Again, I have to put 50 asterisks around that, because this is SAO, and I don't want to get my hopes up for anything, but that would be nice. Now, not everybody was a fan of the jumping back and forth between their perspectives. BBC Otaku wrote in, Reki made the fairly unique decision to split the book into first-person chapters from Kirito's point of view and third-person chapters from Asuna's. There's a reason it's unique. It was awful and read like a road bump. I do not understand why he couldn't write Asuna's parts in the first person. And I picked that out because I actually think it's a good decision on his part. The difference between the first-person narration and the third-person narration helps you immediately clue in on a subconscious level to who's speaking at any given time. I mean, there's also, a less literary reason for it, which is that it allows him to describe Asuna's naked body from the third person, which I guess is as good a point as any to talk about the terrible, awkward fan service in this book. Because there are a lot of parts of this book that just, like, jump in out of nowhere into characters getting naked and fumbling through underwear and stuff like that. Some of which come in the middle of otherwise very tense scenes. Versus Them wrote, "My only biggest complaint with SAOP, and in the manga this is 10 times worse, don't fucking read it, is the fan service. Don't judge the work by that because it'll end up very skewed. It's so brazen that it's unbearable, and so much that if they ever make it into an anime, I think half of these moments will need to be taken out. Some already have been taken out for Chapter 2. We don't have to have Kirito watching a nude Asuna once per volume. It obliterates the seriousness of the plot. Reki has improved a lot everywhere, but it seems he just can't handle his horny perviness." Another basement dweller, Zoe, added to that, "Asuna gets a gratuitous bath scene with an illustration that really just seems to be there for the beaters. Then again, Kirito goes through her panties for basically no reason. The book even flat out stated that people don't need more than one pair of undergarments. He's non-consensually viewing her underwear and looking at it sexually. This is one area that often puts me off in Japanese popular media, where women are so often not given control of their sexuality. I don't actually mind fan service. I think it's really cool. I'm queer and I love girls, but it's awkward when it's handled slowly through the male gaze." And yeah, it's hard to escape that. There's like a scene where Asuna bites into a cream puff and it just sprays cream all over her face. It's like in the middle of a really tense stakeout. It's really weird and awkward and out of place. Like, that's the least gratuitous of the fan service scenes in this book. And they don't really serve a purpose, you know? Like, I guess it helps to characterize Asuna to know that she's like a little bit caught up on all of these comforts from the real world, that she comes from a rich family and therefore she's like, oh, I just want to take a hot bath. But at the same time, like, do we really need a whole chapter where she takes that hot bath and then somebody walks in on her in the middle of it and she runs out screaming and naked? Do we need that? No. And it would be nice if any of these scenes involved any degree of consent from the women involved, because it's all the main character getting this lucky peek at something he shouldn't have access to, which is really creepy. And, you know, I say this as somebody who makes a lot of videos about ecchi content, who really likes ecchi and fan service. Just make sure that the girls are enjoying themselves as well. And it's fine, it's fun, everybody can be on board with it. It feels very forced, and it also feels very uncomfortable to read, and I wish that that stuff hadn't been in there. BBC Otaku kind of hit the nail on the head in talking about this in his email. Reki has this habit of including things in his book because he wants to, but never making them fit into the world he's created. A few examples of this come with Asuna, with her inventory scene and bath scene. I put these two together for the same reason. They should be impossible. Why are there nude character models? Why does Asuna need multiple pairs of underwear when she doesn't need to wash her clothes? Why are they not a part of her character model? Did someone on the dev team have to render various naked female bodies? Why? The answer is because Reki wanted to write a bath scene and because he wanted a scene where Kirito searches through Asuna's underwear. Whether it actually fit doesn't matter. Yeah, the underwear scene's especially gratuitous in that regard because, like, literally, why would somebody who is so driven to die that Kirito meets her in a dungeon fighting off enemies for 4 days straight without eating or doing anything but sleeping in the safe room on the hard wooden floor? Why would somebody who's in that state of nihilism buy multiple nice pieces of lingerie for themselves? Seems weird. Seems very out of character and doesn't really make sense with the story as it's been told. As for there being nude character models, I think you can make a case for that because this is a virtual reality game, and I think it might mess with people's immersion if they felt that their underwear was fused into their bodies. If the underwear doesn't get dirty, she could just wear the underwear in the bath, you know? There's a lot of different ways to do that without her getting naked. The scene also doesn't need to exist at all. And it really slows down the pacing of the story, which is something that bothered me a lot. It's 400 pages long, and it definitely doesn't need to be. Now, there are a lot of other characters outside of Argo, Asuna, and Kirito, obviously, and people had a lot to say about them as well. I was generally pretty happy with how the side characters and supporting characters were handled in this, especially compared to how they've been handled in basically every other piece of SAO media ever. Callum seemed to agree with me on that, saying, "I found myself most impressed by the fleshing out of the side characters. Kibao seems less like a cardboard cutout and more like an actual person. Diavel has more complex plans and motivations behind his actions, and Argo is probably the best side character in the series so far. It's refreshing to have a female character who doesn't just immediately jump on him, and so far her feelings for him seem to be mostly of friendship in a teasing way, barring that one scene during the martial artist section. I'm excited every time she shows up because she's always doing something entertaining or dropping some bombshell of info, where most female side characters previously have just ended up being rather bland and forgettable harem fodder." So, yeah, even when talking about the characters in general, Argo kind of comes to the forefront of the conversation because she's so good. But Kibao and Diavel do, or I forget how his name's pronounced. Kibao and the blue-haired guy from episode 1 do come off as more three-dimensional, and it seems like they have more to them. I mean, I guess it's kind of damning that I don't remember the name of Diavel's attendant at all, because he's a major character in the second arc, and he's just... There's a problem that SAO has where a lot of the characters end up just being part of a unit and not really having a personality outside of the personality of the group that they're in. The Legend Braves is a guild that shows up in the second arc of this, and they are interesting characters, but they're all kind of the same character. So Orlando, their leader, is brash and full of bravado, and the rest of them are all kind of the same thing. And that's kind of a general issue that SAO has, where a lot of its side characters and supporting characters end up being copies of other characters or reflections of the groups that they're in and not necessarily their own individuals. And while Aegil gets a lot of development here too, alongside the characters I've already talked about, outside of that, everybody's kind of just a little bit flat in one note. And that's an issue that I think Jurassic Raptor captured perfectly in his response. Having a story set in an MMO is the perfect excuse to have many named characters with multiple experiences, stories to share, interesting plot threads to go from. Think of how much enjoyment people get from listening to other people talk about their funniest experiences in glitchy Skyrim playthroughs, or through an entire intense GTA playthrough. I got legitimately excited when the second part of the volume revolved around Argo. I thought that it would be a great time for a story without Kirito. Half of the prior part revolving around the first boss battle, the best parts in my opinion, were written in a third-person limited perspective centered around Asuna. Instead, the mystery of Argo's whiskers is, at best, a few paragraphs that literally amounts to, "It was a quest." That could be a great anticlimax, but instead it isn't even really part of the story. Like, even though this whole section is ostensibly about Argo, she's just a minor character in Kirito's experience and learning about her. What's the point in having multiple characters who are supposed to be fully realized characters when all they amount to are quest-giving NPCs? I would have killed for just a few pages of Argo selling the readers the information about how she got her whiskers. That would have been fun. Instead, we get White Knight Kirito like usual and not much else. I stress again, what's the point of expanding the story of Aincrad if there isn't any actual world expansion that doesn't revolve around Kirito, like a boring cliché rock revolves around a pale, bland sun? And yeah, that is kind of an issue. We never meet anyone who Kirito doesn't meet directly, and I think that might have been a better way to handle SAO Progressive as a story, especially since Kirito's whole thing up to his adventures with the Midnight Black Cats and beyond there is that he doesn't really get along with other people. It would have been interesting to see, like, a story from the perspective of somebody else in the leading raid party going from floor to floor and trying to stay on the front line of battling against the bosses, but we only see that from Kirito's perspective. And I think that the idea that Jurassic Raptor points at here, that we could have like a story that's almost an anthology of different people's experiences in Aincrad throughout the entirety of their time trapped in SAO, might have been a better book. That might have been more interesting and engaging. Unfortunately, we're not going to have that because this is and always will be the Kirito show. But I do definitely agree that while the sidecast is expanded beyond the harem and nothing else that it was in the anime, there's still a lot of expansion that could be done, and I think that that would benefit the story overall. Now, obviously, while character development is a very important aspect of world building, it's not the only aspect, and with 400 pages to fill out the world of Aincrad, SAO Progressive does actually do a lot to expand the setting of the SAO series. Part of that involves one of my favorite pet topics about SAO, the game mechanics. The mechanics are still a bit stupid, and I probably wouldn't want to play this game myself, but Reki Kawahara has at least gone out there and tried to make the game of SAO make a little bit more mechanical sense. There's a lot of focus in this book on the individual sword skills and how they're useful in tactics and how they each have their own cooldowns that you have to be wary of while executing the motions that make them happen. So there is a little bit of interesting strategy there that makes me think that maybe that could be fun to play around with, but some of the other stuff, especially related to how upgrades work, is really frustrating. And that's something that quite a few of you guys tapped into when you messaged me. Mega Fighter 3 said, while this book does do a better job of explaining the mechanics, Reki is hamstrung by how closely he's following the original novel, and stuff like having no magic or healers or even classes still rankles me. Hell, Rondo introduces flying mobs to the world, and there's no ranged weaponry beyond limited throwing knives and a rare drop chakram. And don't even get me started on the potions going pixel by pixel, and if you drink another potion before the cooldown finishes, the effect doesn't stack. At least Kawahara understands how tanks work in MMOs now. Yeah, that's pretty frustrating. I guess there's a logic behind the slow healing, although the fact that potions don't stack in that environment feels kind of bullshit. It does make sense to try to make the damage a little more permanent and give people consequences for their actions. That much makes sense to me. But I do especially agree that the lack of ranged weapons in SAO is really weird because, even if you're trying to go by, a more traditional medieval representation of battles and warfare, and you don't want to get into the whole swords and sorcery bit, which I can understand. There's a certain people who that fantasy appeals to. Bows and arrows have been a thing forever, and I don't think that there's a single medieval military force that didn't have some kind of handheld projectile weaponry. It may not have been the main focus of their forces, but there should be bow wielders in SAO. That just makes sense to me. Not just from it makes sense it would be in that setting. It would be fun for players. There's gotta be at least as many people who fantasize about being Legolas and sliding down the banister going pew, 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 as there are people who are I wanna fight some orcs going swing, 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 Those are all childish fantasies that people who like fantasy novels have. So yeah, in addition to it being a problem for the gameplay balance, that there's no ranged weapons except for weird rare ones, it just seems like it would hurt its sales not to have that as a fantasy option. And also there's potential for ranged versus close range PvP that's really fun. They even play on that in Gun Gale Online with Kirito deflecting the bullets with his laser sword. Why couldn't that be worked into how people with bows and arrows are dealt with by people with swords in the game? I don't know. There's a lot of room for expanding how SAO is played that would still completely fit into its no magic, no bullshit sensibilities, while also making it more fun, giving more diverse play styles, and just I don't know. I do definitely agree. It's weird that throwing knives are a thing here and bows and arrows aren't. So far. Maybe they show up later. Who knows? There's some other smaller points of game design that come up here that seem a little bit bullshit. Callum points out that the enemies who steal people's weapons with a chance of them permanently losing it if they can't catch them are rife for exploitation by players trying to steal other players' weapons and are just generally kind of bullshit and unfun in general. I'm inclined to agree with that. I don't like when enemies steal my resources in anything but a roguelike where, the permanent consequences are part of the game. In an MMO where it's something that you can potentially be working for days to get a legendary weapon, to just have that be stolen from you out of the blue by a random mob in a dungeon is some real bullshit that does sound unfair. Zoe does point out that these mechanical exploits can lead to interesting stories, though, saying the exploitation of game mechanics, like for the Nezuha mystery, for example, were the best parts of the book. I wish that Kawahara just wrote a trapped in a game world mystery series. I'm sure there's novels out there like that with a mystery involving the exploitation of the world's mechanics, but he has a knack for writing it. It helps that his light prose fits mystery quite well. He needs to learn to put more information forward, tell us things like quick change, the item stance, that sort of thing, but I'd be excited to read Mystery Art Online by Reki Kawahara. Kyle offered up more of a mixed take on that mystery writing, saying, Rondo for a Fragile Blade might be my favorite story to come out of SAO so far. Not only did the chapter provide more detail on many of the game's systems, it also had a very important conflict surrounding the game's first upgrade scam and the question of how law would be carried out within the player base. Reki described this story as a sort of mystery, and my major complaint with it is one that I have with a lot of mystery stories. Basically, there's no way for the reader to possibly infer the solution to the mystery until after the solution has been presented and explained. This is largely due to the fact that the mystery itself relies on the game's systems, which the reader can't possibly know. That said, the trick itself is actually pretty neat, and seems totally feasible once all the systems are explained. So, spoiler warning. Go to this timestamp to get out of the spoiler section. The mystery they're talking about involves this blacksmith character named Nezuha, who's the main character of Rondo of a Fragile Blade, and he is running this scam where he pretends to fail at upgrading rare weapons and then steals them from their owners and sells them off so that his guild can build up a really, really impressive set of gear. And the way that he does this is he hides his quick change menu on the carpet in front of him at his blacksmithing stall, which I think is actually a really cool exploitation of the way that SAO handles its menu systems as physical objects. You know, I've said before that SAO's menu system should all be inside the mind, but looking at how it's used in this story, I do think that there's enough interesting potential there in mechanical exploitation of that menu system that maybe it is worthwhile, even if it would be less convenient than just thinking what you want and getting it. Now, the one place where I really differ from Zoe and Kyle on this is that I think that the mystery is actually kind of obvious. They set up this mystery, and then like right after that there's this really pointless aside where Kirito starts talking about the quick change system and how it's used for these enemies much later in the game, and at that point it becomes really obvious that there is more purpose to him having that conversation than just to deliver random exposition about something that wouldn't matter. And there's just not enough in the way of red herrings to throw you off the trail that the quick change mechanic obviously has to play a role in Nezuha's scheme. So in that regard, I would say that this mystery is kind of flawed for almost the opposite reasons that they said, but I also agree that the idea of mysteries set within a game world is really cool because, you know, mysteries are all about logic and video games are fundamentally all about logical, solvable systems. So those two things really do go together like peanut butter and jam. Log Horizon has a lot of fun with that kind of storytelling, and that's a big reason that I really like that series. So I do like these video game mystery stories, and I think that SAO generally handles them decently well. I do agree that these kinds of mystery stories are probably the best use of Reki Kawahara's talents, because he's pretty decent at setting up logical connections between systems when he wants to be. Sometimes he just throws things in because he wants them there. And he's not so great at writing characters outside of their basic motivations and wants and needs, but that's kind of all you need to have a really compelling mystery story. And I do think that Rondo of a Fragile Blade really plays to his strengths. Now, not everything about Rondo of a Fragile Blade is perfect. As Callum brings up, Nezuha coming in with the chakram, besides being something I called from a mile away, seems odd to me. He's described as having difficulty perceiving distance due to incompatibility with the nerve gear, but he's able to make long-range attacks on a weak point. Either there's some sort of sight-based lock-on function that isn't mentioned in the game, Reki forgot to think about how depth perception is important in aiming ranged weapons due to gravity or moving targets, or there needs to be some more explanation about the mechanics of ranged weapons. Something about that whole scene seemed off to me. Yeah, I do kind of agree that the end of Nezuha's arc seems a little bit silly. The idea of nerve gear non-compliance is really interesting and something that I wish was explored more within the book. And yeah, I do think that the way that the story is wrapped up is a little bit silly in that regard because, yeah, if somebody doesn't have any depth perception and that is preventing them from fighting with swords, it would logically make sense that they would have difficulty leading targets and throwing things at them accurately while they're moving at a distance. But, you know, at the end of the day, it is cool that Nezuha gets his big hero moment. Not to spoil what happens, but I do like the way that his character arc goes. And while the logic might not shake out perfectly, the catharsis of his redemption arc is satisfying enough to make up for that, at least for me. Now, outside of the game mechanics, the world building is a little bit light. And one thing that really bothered me is that in 400 pages, we don't learn anything about Aincrad's lore. Adrian brings this up in his email, saying, "The world building is non-existent. It was horrible. Absolutely horrible. I felt betrayed when I saw how little detail there was in describing the first 2 floors. Their descriptions and backgrounds felt so dry that I couldn't paint a clear picture of the world Reki was going for on each floor. I felt like if I asked my 5-year-old niece to draw me a map of each floor, she could give me something more detailed than Reki did. The environment of any area of the game is made up of the scenery and backstory of that area, flavor text from items and mobs within the level. Taking Dark Souls 3 as an example, the Cathedral of the Deep area hits all the right marks. The entire area is corrupted by Aldrich's teachings and heinous magic. The cathedral itself is dimly lit, filled with undead priests and knights, and it all leads up to Aldrich's tomb and his most loyal congregation. All of this put together sets a dark tone and shows us the history of a once holy land being taken over and corrupted by the cannibalistic Aldrich. The first floor of Aincrad is a generic forest and plains area filled with boars. The second floor is a mountainous area with cows. Wow, how fascinating. It's back to basics, like in the anime. Generic terrain, generic dungeons, generic towns. My goodness, at least describe some fucking architecture. The only descriptor we get is that the buildings on the second floor are tall because they're on a mountaintop. I'm not asking for much. I was promised more time on each floor so that I could get the adventure part in this RPG, and that's not the case at all. And I agree there. I think that the setting descriptions are pretty flat, and what is described is unimaginative. Both of the boss chambers we've seen so far have been just big empty rooms with big monsters in them, and I feel like the lore of the world could be expanded on more. Every real video game has a lot of intricate backstory to it. That's what draws players in and helps them get immersed in the setting. Like, World of Warcraft is not just a generic fantasy world, it's the world of Warcraft, and it's got a long history that a lot of players care a lot about. And maybe Kirito's not a lore hound. Maybe he's just one of those players who skips through all the flavor text in every mission that he does, but it feels a little empty that none of that is shown to us at any point in this book. And that is something that I really wish had been expanded on more. There's connections between the monsters in the dungeons and the field, like the first floor's dungeon is obviously a keep full of kobolds with a lord of the kobolds as the boss, and the second floor has all of these bull monsters that are led by the minotaurs who occupy the dungeon, but like, they're just monsters in a dungeon. They don't really seem to have an actual society there. It would be neat if instead of a big empty chamber, when they got to the top of the second floor, they found the throne room of the Taurus King or something like that. I don't know. There's a lot more that could be done in terms of making Aincrad feel like not a real place, but a fantasy place that a real human crafted for people to get immersed in. Right now, it just feels like a big empty sandbox with no real backstory behind it, and that doesn't seem like the kind of game I'd really want to play. Now, on the other side of this world building, Zoe brings up a really interesting point about some missed opportunities to expand on the sociological implications of some of SAO's systems and the way that the death game is handled. As she says, out of all the 10,000 people in SAO, I doubt that none of them were trans. Depending on how the nerve gear scans somebody, they may have had the feeling of looking like they wanted to for the first time in their lives, and Kayaba Akihiko ripped that away. When you boil it down, the most infuriating thing about SAO Progressive is that it simply refuses to engage with any of its concepts. It doesn't try to think about anything any more deeply than it could. In Sword Art Online, there are no autistic people who have trouble because the game-generated sensations feel awkward from their hypersensitivity to certain textures. There are no trans people who finally got to present as their preferred gender only to get that ripped away. There's no exploration of glitches or discussion of internet connections dropping. Not once do we encounter a disabled person regaining their sight because the nerves were still working but their eyes didn't function. No player-made art is talked about. The few thousand people content to sit around do nothing for months. Full dive nonconformity is barely even given a passing mention despite being a great concept. And yeah, I agree. There's a lot of interesting angles that this world opens up that I guess Reki Kawahara is just not interested in exploring, and I don't think that every writer needs to explore every angle of every world that they build. It would be really nice if he acknowledged those aspects at all. But on the flip side of that, I would say that those gaps in SAO provide an interesting opportunity for perhaps a better writer to explore those ideas in ways that Reki Kawahara either doesn't want to or isn't equipped to. And I would really like to see that. Now that we've gone into the nitty-gritty about SAO Progressive's flaws and good points, I think it's about time that we wrap things up. But since this isn't just my show here, I'd like to bring in some of your conclusions about the show as well. Flautist Acacia wrote, I enjoyed the book much more than I thought I would. Kirito is a bit better written, Kirito the pun master is kind of amazing, but self-insert pro-tags do work better in a book most of the time. Asuna at first was insufferable, but really grew into personality that I enjoyed reading. And also it was cool to see more game terminology used. There were tanks in the raid, although SAO still sounds like a terrible game with crafting and support skills not being there, which is kinda acknowledged, but I don't know how much better that makes it. I really liked the second part with the upgrade fraud, and seeing Kirito and Asuna interact more solidified their relationship more than what happened in the anime, from what I can remember. I'm not sure what else I can say other than I enjoyed reading it, although I'm not sure I like it enough to continue the series without it going on sale or another book club happening. I really hope this can take off and you can do more light novel stuff. That's the plan. I'm also planning to do some manga stuff. Ariel said, SAO Progressive is basically what if SAO was good? What if Kirito and Asuna were actual people with actual thoughts and personalities? What if Kirito made fucking puns? And I adore it. It still has some gratuitous fan service because it's SAO, but Kirito is an actual person. It's written in the first person, which means we get to see what he's thinking and feeling, and that makes him actually interesting. Oria P said, it's clear that Reki Kawahara made an effort to fix the problems with SAO's most important arc, and he delivered, in my opinion. Everything in the story is much more detailed compared to the original series. I honestly feel like the characters have more room to be built, as there's no massive time skip looming in the distance, and it shows that he took his time with detailing everything that needed to be detailed. Each floor's theme and what's special about it actually gets talked about by the main duo. The fights against monsters and the floor bosses are detailed compared to the anime. Some of the game's systems and things that we don't know get talked about too. And mostly it shines more on Kirito and Asuna's adventures as a team. As I don't want to give away too much if you haven't finished the book, overall it's a huge improvement on the Aincrad arc and is a good read. I recently ordered the 5th book in the series and I'm waiting for July when the 6th one comes out. Canon Spectacle, who also came up and said hi to me at Anime Expo, said, overall, the book was fine. It was the sort of wish fulfillment garbage I loved in early high school, but that doesn't mean it was good. I liked that Reki Kawahara actually put effort into trying to describe the mechanics of the game, even if it's a pretty terrible design overall, and making Asuna a goofy nerd was kind of fun, but that's basically where the good parts end. The foreshadowing was incredibly ham-fisted, the twists were obvious, the conflict resolution was cheesy, and overall the book felt like it was written by a 12-year-old. It didn't even have the animation to make it enjoyable to watch. I think that's a bit harsh, but at the same time, I can definitely see where you're coming from, and this is predominantly a piece of nerdy wish fulfillment and nothing more. One of you basement dwellers, Zach, came up with a really interesting take on the book's themes that I want to share with you. There's part of the book that clearly wants to express an idea, even if it then gets distracted by monster fights and teenage panties. It kind of occurred to me after the battle with the first boss and the beater label getting tossed around that there were some rather Randian tones being taken toward the masses versus Kirito. Looking at the whole story through that lens, it explains why being good is seen as cheating. The common people with no experience, seem to only exist to leech off the skill, experience, and techniques that players who practice and risk their lives, and yes, sometimes just get lucky have. When one of these players, Argo, hands down some of these techniques to people and they are insufficient, it suddenly is not enough, even though the amount of lives saved by Argo's handbook was most likely significant. Asuna, meanwhile, stands out from the mob of takers as someone who pulls herself up and learns on her own, fights largely by herself, and in short acts far more like the beta testers did early on, even with the risk of death. While I have some issues with the message behind it, the story makes a lot more sense if you view people like Kibao as stand-ins for those masses, Kirito as that exceptional individual who strives to be great on his own without being reliant on the help of others, Asuna as someone pulling herself up by her bootstraps and naturally refusing to be like Kibao and those people, Egel as someone who is more inspired by Kirito and doesn't care about out his reputation, and as we know later on, opens up a shop, one of the most free market things someone can do. Chapter 2 kind of hammers this home right away while describing a pretty textbook free market exchange. I'm curious to see if this undercurrent continues throughout, or if it was just happenstance. I am too, and I've genuinely never looked at SAO as a piece of Randian fiction, because, I mean, I mostly see it as a kind of dumb gamer bro story for people to escape into, but that would probably explain to some extent why I disagree with a lot of the underlying principles of the story, and it's just an interesting lens through which to look at SAO. I haven't had a chance to really consider it beyond what he said in his email, but I don't know, at some point I might go back and look at the series through that lens and see how much sense I can make of it. It's a very interesting point, and I appreciate you sending that in, Zach. Now, as for my own thoughts and feelings about the book, I didn't hate it, which is honestly better than I expected to feel. I liked some parts of it. I thought that the banter between Kirito and Asuna was fun. I definitely think that it could have been cut down. We didn't need any of those fan service scenes, and there's a lot of extraneous detail that just doesn't need to be there or doesn't need to be explored in as much depth as it is. We definitely didn't need a page-long aside where Kirito explains why it's weird for a girl to be in an MMO. So yeah, I think that SAO Progressive could use an editor, but mostly because I'm a really, really big fan of Argo as a character, I am probably going to continue reading this, just not immediately, because right now I am just exhausted, and it's not just the process of reading that's gotten me there, because I recently did read through an entire light novel that I enjoyed in a day, and we'll be talking about that on our second channel. It's just that this story is kind of dragged out a little too far, and I am not up for reading another 400 pages of SAO just yet. But while I didn't expect to say this at all, I will probably read more of SAO Progressive in the future, just to see where it goes, because it's not a great story or even a very good story yet, but there's something there that I do like, and I am seeing improvement on Reki's part, like significant improvement in how he handles his characters, so I would like to see where this goes, and I probably will read more in the future. Now, as for what we're going to be reading next, I'd like to shift gears a bit and talk about a manga, because comics are fun, and sometimes it's easier to read when there's pictures involved. I'm actually not sure which manga we're going to be reading yet, so there is a poll up on Twitter, link in the doobly-doo, that you can check out to vote for which manga you would most like to read next as part of the book club. Once we've decided on a winner for that, I will announce it in a future video, and then you guys will have time to do more of the same thing. Also, I would really appreciate it if you could let me know in the comments below what you thought of this format, because I was sort of flying by the seat of my pants in figuring out how to make this video, and what I landed on was sort of chopping up people's opinions into bits and pieces that could fit into overarching categories, but that might not be the best way to handle this book club. So this is as much your show as it is mine, and I would really love your feedback as to how you'd like to see it improved, or how you'd like to see people's emails and comments presented. Maybe we could have people send video submissions. I don't know. There are a ton of different ways that I could be handling this, and I'm not sure if this was the most entertaining one, but I would really like to figure it out because I want to read more, and it seems like a lot of you guys want to read more too. Now, this video was sponsored by Bookwalker, and while you're waiting for us to decide which manga we're going to read, I do have another recommendation for you to check out. Arifureta is a light novel that had an anime adaptation this season, and the anime adaptation is, to put it nicely, not very good, but the novel itself is actually pretty damn well written from what I've read so far. It's been described as better Shield Hero, so if that's something you'd be interested in, check that out on Bookwalker, and make sure that you use the promo code BASEMENT when you check out for that 600 yen discount. That can also be used for any of the other hundreds of light novels and manga that they have on their store. I am so tired. I have been recording for couple hours straight with breaks in between. This was a lot more of a challenge than I thought it'd be, so I'm going to call it a day for now. I'm Geoff Thew, professional shitbag, signing out from my mother's basement.
Oh, thank God it's finally over.
Yes! Freedom! I just sprayed spit all toward the camera.
Good.
Don't.
Patreon.com/mothersbasement.
I'm so moist. Ah!
Stop.